This is one of those videos that I film and edit and then feel somewhat uncertain about whether I should release it or not, as it shows me getting frustrated and failing to create what in my mind was a relatively simple object. It begins with these 3 bowls, pieces I made and fired recently, and whilst I like the outcome, it's the actual shape of the pots I'm not certain about. I prefer these ones, stacked behind. The feet are narrower in relation to the body, and generally they feel a bit more refined as compared to this trio. And I do really like this mossy green glaze as it pools in the crevices so nicely, but I think tonally, on a larger object, it doesn't quite work. And instead I want to coat it with one of these. This one, for instance, is the exact same glaze but without the titanium, which means it's cooler in tone. It's a bit more blue, and less so the army khaki green, which I think has to go on a bit more thickly overall, as I'm not necessarily as keen on the green when it's thinner, whereas with the blue, I think I won't mind it so much. In both cases though, I think I need to apply the glaze thicker in the future. So, the idea is to throw a much larger bowl, made from 5 kilograms of clay, thrown to an angular shape with a stepped rim, and with plenty of clay left in the base, so that it can eventually be trimmed back to the narrow foot I want. In hindsight, I'm using clay that's perhaps a bit too hard, and in the long run I don't treat it particularly well, and this really wasn't a day of throwing that went my way. In fact, I stopped making as soon as I got something off the wheel that I knew I could work with, as I just really wasn't in the mood. Everybody has their bad days, and the throwing you're about to see is, well, pretty abysmal. And I think part of that was from my over-reliance on this, drying out the clay a bit too much at the wrong moment, I think. I also, with larger amounts of clay, especially when it's firm like this, need to force myself to cone it up and down more times. Anyway, at least the centering, opening up, and the initial pulling of the walls went relatively well, so let's start with the positive, at least. I begin by patting it centered as best I can, and then, as this clay really was on the hard side, to make things a little bit easier, I run my hand up the outside, scraping away the clay from the furthest point that spins around, which I can then add back onto the top of the lump. Now, this technique works really well when the clay is softer, as the material that's being added back to the top simply meshes back into the lump, whereas in this instance with the clay being firmer, I don't think that actually happened, and I think this resulted in me creating some unevenness in the very top, which only came back to haunt me a bit later on. Anyway, with the sides scraped, I begin to center the lump of clay. I wet the mass and cone it up from the bottom before compressing it down. This is the step I should have done more thoroughly with this piece of clay. Ultimately though, it's pressed into a shape with a flat top and flat sides, and it should feel as if it spins underneath your hands without any slight movements or undulations. Now, the way I open up a lump of clay if I'm making a bowl is different as compared to if I was making a simple cylinder. In that instance, say I was making a tall jar or a jug, I create a hollow on the inside of the lump that's quite squared off and wide, with relatively thick walls on both sides. It's then these walls I squeeze and pull up. With a bowl though, as I want it to have a curved interior, instead of creating a squared off opening, I create a V shape, like this, initially, with a rounded bottom which I can widen as I go. But it's really important to keep that rounded shape on the interior at all times. The only trouble with this is it means there are thicker walls around the outside, and this can make the initial pull or two really tricky, as there's just so much material to squeeze between your hands. But the exterior shape should sort of mimic what you throw on the inside, and I plan on trimming the outside of this vessel a lot. Anyway, the other thing I'm going to do is make sure I leave plenty of clay in the base, as I want this bowl to have a really lovely tall foot, a pedestal, to raise it up on whatever surface it's placed on significantly. This small diagram does exaggerate the V shape, by the way. You can definitely have a more rounded, wider shape than this, but the stark difference should demonstrate the differences in how you open up certain shapes depending on the type of pot you're making. So, to actually open up, I find center, wet the top, and then use my thumb and index finger to make the initial indentation. As you do this, you'll notice that the hole itself dries out really quickly as you exert pressure downward. I then switch from my thumb to using most of my fingertips on my left hand, all of which are pushing down in the center, creating that rough V shape I spoke about earlier. With the initial hole created, I reach my hands inside and draw the clay out to create a more dramatic V shape. And if the top of the lump of clay has any unevenness in it, like this, I'll wet the top and then cup my hands around it, rounding the walls and creating a much more even shape. You can just about see the V shape I was speaking about. And I suppose the thing is, if you create a flat bottom on a piece like this, you will eventually have to round it, so you're better off just beginning with that rounded shape. The thick walls are then collared in and pulled up, and I tend to prefer pulling up a cylinder to begin with that's left relatively thick, which is then stretched out. The walls thinning as the cylinder gets wider. This is also why it's important to leave enough clay in the rim, as if at this stage it was really sharp and mean, by the time it's stretched out, the lip could crack or split, so it's better having too much clay in the rim as compared to too little. and you can see at this point how the bowl quickly loses its shape, especially after I try and implement the indentation in the lip. I think my movements generally were a bit too quick, meaning they didn't affect the entirety of the walls. Consistent, even, and slow movements really are key when making bigger pieces, and it's something I'm constantly having to remind myself. Anyway, I went away, wedged up this clay, and came back to the wheel. It's slightly softer this time. This made the lump of clay much easier to centre, and in general it felt a bit more responsive to my movements. The throwing was going well too, and I actually thinned out the top just a touch, as I was thinking in my previous attempt I may have left the top too heavy, which, compared to the thinner walls underneath, caused it to lose control somewhat. And it's always when this indentation is made and I try and introduce the angularity to the vessel that things begin to go awry. So I stiffened up the outside with a heat gun, tried to balance it on a tape measure, and that's when this happened. Yep. The tape measure fell on the pedal, causing the wheel to spin as fast as it can. I'm sure this has happened to all of us, in one way or another. But it really is a shock having the pot simply spinning in front of you, and then suddenly tearing itself apart. It really does make you jump. So, let's try one last time, and I think no matter what I end up with, at this point, I'm going to have to make it work. The lump of clay is centered, as normal, opened up, a process I do really slowly, digging my fingers into it, as it's so often during the opening up stage that a new undulation is introduced into the lump of clay. The thicker walls then collared up into a conical shape, forcing that really thick massive clay into thinner walls that should be easier to pull up hereafter. This attempt was going much better, although there was still some wonkiness in the rim, so using a wire held taut between two hands, I tried to cut away the highest point that spins around. And if you hold the wire there long enough, you can actually collect much of the excess that comes off. And the scraps that come off and stick to the side of the pot, well, I won't try and deal with them until a bit later. You can't do everything at once, so I focus on the very top to begin with, and then I'll begin to tidy up the outside after. And lo and behold, again, when I introduce that angular section at the top, that's when this subtle undulation appeared, but it is only subtle, so I'm going to keep going as best I can and leave the upper sections of the walls relatively thick. This way, if the vessel does make it off the wheel, I'll eventually be able to trim it back into the right shape. I now need to throw the step in this top section, so I'm going to hold a plastic kidney steady on the outside and then push the clay out against it. I then spent some time trying to refine it and remove this slight kick the wall had. It's strange. It almost feels as if there's a lump of harder clay within this mass, right where that slight sway is in the wall. The inside though is also a mess, so I'm simply just going to try and forget about it, and let this pot turn leather hard over a couple of days before I trim the absolute hell out of it. The following morning, with the bowl still relatively soft, I thought I'd have a go at correcting the slight movement in the lip, which I did by holding this metal kidney where I wanted the profile of the pot to be, and then I consistently and slowly pushed the clay out against it. I then used an old turning tool held steadily around the rim to scrape away that high point that span around slowly. There's no way I'm going to be able to get it perfect, but I think through drying it carefully and trimming it, I'm confident I'll be able to get this bowl into a place that you will never be able to see that undulation. But it's going to be a bit tricky. So, for the time being, I'm going to cover it in plastic and dry this pot slowly. This way the pot doesn't warp anymore as it dries out. Early the following morning, I flipped it upside down, centered it, and then tried to scrape away the highest point that spins around, eliminating that really slight undulation that's in the wall. I even did this with the turning tool, which you can see only removes clay from one side of the vessel. I center the rim of the pot itself, not necessarily the base or the bat, and with that true, I can then turn away the unevenness in the wall just by holding the tool dead steady and gradually shaving down that proud section that's spinning around. The clay here, by the way, is still far too soft to trim properly, but it's firm enough that it can take a bit of turning. You can see this in how the turnings stick to themselves and to the tool, whereas when the clay is in the ideal condition, it should just spring away in lovely long strands that don't clog up your tool or stick back onto the pot. I also did a bit of this on the walls above, just removing the undulating part that comes around, and then I left the pot upside down overnight to dry out properly. You know it's going to be a good package when it's been stopped and inspected by the border force. Recently, there have been a lot of people reaching out asking to send me tools. I've said no to many of them, but this one sounded particularly exciting. It's a trimming tool made by a guy called Devon, who has prior experience in aerospace engineering. After getting into pottery himself, he acquired the tools to make his own tungsten carbide tools for himself and his friends, and well, for me. He watches my videos and wanted to send me one to test, and sadly for you, he doesn't make these commercially yet. And the reason I say sadly is because this is probably the most beautiful, the sharpest, well-crafted tungsten carbide trimmer I've ever held or used. It's really completely breathtaking, and I almost don't want to use it as I don't want to ruin its pristine state. It's a work of art, from the blade itself, which is smooth and shiny beyond anything I've seen before, to the handle, which is asymmetrical and fits my hand perfectly. And then there are the small details, like the portion of metal the blade is soldered onto, and the ferrule itself, where this length of metal is inserted. Even this section, with its faceted profile, is just gorgeous. It's unlike anything else that's out there. It really is just, honestly, perfection. And if he did actually choose to make these on a larger scale, compared to anything else that's out there, he could charge a fortune for these. There's always pottery fanatics out there like me, willing to drop too much of their savings on tools like this. So, Devon, thank you. You can find him on Instagram at sophisticated_pagan, and I'll include a number of links to his profile down in the description below. So, let's see if I can save this arguably bad pot with this glorious trimming tool. I'm going to begin by fixing the inside, which was left a bit too rough and ready for me. So it's placed onto some slip, tap centered, and at this point I'm really focusing on centering the rim more than anything else. As if this part is centered, I should be able to trim everything underneath it back to spinning true, as there's enough clay in the walls for a considerable amount of alterations. For the inside, all I'm going to be doing is correcting the curve so it travels evenly from the very centre up to where the steps are in the walls. Sadly, due to the shape of this portion, I can't use my new trimming tool yet, but I'm itching to see how it works. I also used this moment to turn away some excess, thinning the walls from the inside and creating a more generous shape. I then smooth over all of the turning marks using a sharp kidney, and then burnish that surface smooth with a plastic one, which is something I really should have waited to do until after I had trimmed the lip. And Devon's tool just sunk through the clay, although I still won't be able to use it much on this part of the pot, simply due to the angle itself. And so far so good, and look at all these lovely trimmings. Although after scraping all of these out, I'm going to have to clean up the interior surface again. It's back to my trusty steel tool for finishing off the rest of the lip. Despite not being the sharpest tool, its shape is just so versatile. And like I've said before, when you're trimming pots, it's not so much the tools you use that make all the difference. It's you. It's your hands. It's how you hold the tool and how you use them. Because ultimately, I could trim a pot to the same level with bad tools as compared to good ones. It's experience, I think, that makes the biggest difference when trimming. As for instance, if you're new to turning and you purchase some tungsten carbide turning tools, they might actually only make the process more difficult. And the analogy I always use, and you're probably all sick of hearing, is that you would never teach someone how to drive in a sports car, as they're just too powerful and dangerous. And the same thing, to some degree, can be said about tungsten carbide turning tools. They're really sharp, they're expensive, they break easily, and there's a certain knack to using them. For example, tungsten tools on a slightly grogged clay body will often leave a chattered, textured surface, and in many ways I simply use these tools as a means to remove mass from a pot. Then I switch to steel turning tools and scrapers to smooth over the surface and to finish it. But as tungsten tools are sharper, it means I can trim pots more thinly with less pressure being exerted onto the shape, which could otherwise deform the pot if I was using a tool that wasn't so sharp. But if you are just starting out in this craft and you're looking for a trimming tool that will make all the difference and make you a better trimmer, don't get one of these. It really isn't going to help, but once you've gained a considerable amount of experience, get one, and maybe, like me, you'll just fall in love with them. Although, having said that, they really aren't for everybody, and I guess just like anything in life, people have their preferences, and these are definitely mine. Okay, ramble over. So, with the walls mostly trimmed, I'm now moving my attention onto the foot, which I'll trim to be narrower than the feet on the other bowls. The tool I'm pushing down with, by the way, is a spinner, and as you might have noticed, this pot isn't being held down by anything as I trim it. There's nothing around the rim, and the bat itself that this bowl sits on isn't attached to the wheel head, but the pot itself is relatively heavy and it's low and wide, so for the most part it's holding itself down. But by exerting downward pressure through the spinner, through the base, it just helps to keep the bowl held down more securely. Again, this isn't advice I'd offer to a beginner. Hold your pot down properly, for God's sake, as all it takes is one wrong movement, or for the tool to catch, for the piece to be nudged off-centre and fling itself against the wheel tray, potentially destroying the object. The only good thing about trimming a pot with nothing holding it down is that I can easily lift it off the wheel and feel the cross-section to find where it's thicker and where clay can still be removed from. Hence why I'm trimming away just a touch more on the walls, although I'm sure most of the excess weight that's left is inside that thick foot I've left on the bottom. For this part, I bevel the outer edge, turn the underside completely flat, and then I begin to hollow out clay from inside this foot, bit by bit, which, as it is so substantial, will take a bit of time, as the clay that's revealed will be damper than what's on the outside, meaning the clay will stick to the blade of the tool and the internal walls of the foot. The outer portion itself has to be left with some heft to it. For instance, if I was to trim the foot itself to be really thin and weedy, there's quite a high chance it will deform, distorting as it reaches that top temperature in the final firing. So the walls are left relatively thick, and the bottom edge is beveled on either side to help give it the appearance that it's thinner. I then burnished the inside of the foot with a plastic kidney, as the only thing with these new glazes is that any scratches left on the surface remain really visible, even if coated quite thickly. I don't mind any small scratches or marks, but anything significant I have to get rid of. The base itself is stamped with my maker's mark, a process that always displaces some clay to the sides and upward, hence why I burnish the foot again thereafter to flatten and correct any slight distortion there might be. And here's the big reveal. I'll flip the pot the right way round and briefly burnish the lip just to remove any indentations left over from the wooden bat. And it doesn't look too bad, does it, considering the pot I started off with. The step in the rim is lovely and crisp, both inside and out. And this turning tool by Devon made the process all the more straightforward. It's going to see a lot of use in the future. As for this bowl though, well, you're going to have to wait to see it glazed, as will I. After I've shipped out all the pots from my latest shop restock, I'll begin a new making cycle, which means there's going to be a lot more making videos, rather than those that show the project from beginning to end. This also means that if there's anything in particular you'd like to see me create, let me know. And no, I won't be making any moon jars, but if you would like to hear me rant about that, well, that could also make an interesting video, perhaps. For the time being though, let's weigh this bowl to see how much clay was removed. 2.2 kilos, which is less than half the original throwing weight. Not bad. Anyhow, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and an even greater thank you if you did participate in my latest shop restock. I know actually obtaining something is rather difficult these days, but your support, whether you got something or not, all means so much.